This podcast is made possible through listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. And the Florence County Museum, presenting Edward Gay, an American landscape painter, chronicling Gay's evolving style amid the turn of the 20th century and his unique connections to South Carolina and the National Academy of Design. Now through February 23rd, flocomuseum.org. And Meadow Garden, home of George Walton, one of the youngest signers of the Declaration of Independence. Open for tours Monday through Friday, 10 to 4. Learn more at historicmeadowgarden.org and visit augusta.com.
From South Carolina Public Radio, this is Walter Edgar's Journal. I'm Walter Edgar, welcoming you to our podcast about South Carolina culture and history, with a nod to all things Southern. Today, we'll be talking with Evan Nooe about his book, Aggression and Sufferings, Settler Violence, Native Resistance, and the Coalescence of the Old South.
In his book, Nooe argues that through the experiences and selective memory of settlers in the antebellum South, white Southerners incorporated their aggression against and suffering at the hands of the indigenous peoples of the Southeast in the coalescence of a regional identity.
In his view, aggression and sufferings are broad categories that can be used to represent the framework of factors contributing to the coalescence of the Old South. Evan, thank you so much for driving down from USC Lancaster to talk about your latest book, Aggression and Sufferings, Settler Violence, Native Resistance, and the Coalescence of the Old South. But before we get into our book, let's find out a little bit about you. Where are you from? Where you went to school?
Who are your folks?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Well, I grew up in Florida, basically sort of in northern central Florida in Ormond Beach, just north of Daytona. I took interest in Florida history, and it wasn't necessarily something I was always intending to do when I started my college trajectory. But I went to the University of Florida for my undergraduate, and there I was dual major as both history and psychology BA. There were some changes in the psychology program there that kind of threw me a little bit off track, but I was more leaning towards history by my junior year anyways, and looking to explore sort of further interest in the history of the American South widely. So after completing my bachelor's degree at the University of Florida, I had the opportunity to go to Clemson University and work in a very fantastic master's program there, where I got to work with a pair of really great Southern historians, Rod Andrew Jr. and Paul C. Anderson. Both are still there at the university, and both helped direct a really foundational master's thesis for me that really set the trajectory for this project. And then after I completed that master's degree at Clemson, I went over to the University of Mississippi, which is, again, a fantastic institution for Southern history. They have the great history department, but also the Center for the Study of Southern Culture, and then a very talented group of faculty that were working in the anthropology department that overlapped with Native American history. So I was able to really blend this interdisciplinary approach while I was at my PhD institution with looking at sort of traditional historical methodologies, but then also Southern studies and then anthropological methodologies as well. And so the background I got, the dissertation that I worked on, really helped set the trajectory of what this book eventually became. Then after I graduated, I've moved around the American South for a little bit, had a position at Austin Peay State University for a bit. I was working at UNC Charlotte for a little while when I moved over to North Carolina, and now I'm at USC Lancaster, where I'm an assistant professor of history there and also the historian for the Native American Studies Center.
All right. I can't help but ask you, because after having read your book, you said growing up you got interested in Florida history, but the Florida history that you learned was far different from the kind of history you write about.
Well, I think in a sense, when we talk about sort of Florida history, it often is a very sort of malleable space and how we conceive of what Florida is and where it fits in the American South. One of the things that I wanted to focus on when I was writing this regional history is certainly sort of consider how Florida fits into this picture of the Old South. When we talk about Florida, there's often this perception about its sort of Spanish colonial past, which is certainly a very foundational part of not just the Florida story, but the American story as well. But then when you think about sort of modern day perspectives of where Florida sits in this region, that it's often portrayed as an outlier, that it doesn't necessarily fit when we think of places like Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, and Mississippi. But when we look at this antebellum period, when we look at sort of the things that led to the acquisition of Florida in the early 19th century, they were very fundamental to what the Southern experience and sort of Southern historical trajectory was in those moments.
Expanding the frontier, whether it's west or expanding south.
Absolutely.
And actually South Carolinians in the 18th century, people like Henry Lawrence, had been investing in Florida lands because, of course, after the French and Indian War, as it was then called, Florida became an English colony.
Certainly.
And South Carolinians purchased land down there, again, to expand their planting interests.
Yeah, and we see after the acquisition of Florida that South Carolinians are very involved in what goes on in there. And this sort of connection basically between out of Charleston to St. Augustine made a very easy sort of ocean-going route for travel. And we see this come into play with South Carolina and the Second Seminole War in the 1830s and 1840s.
Okay. The title of your book is interesting. I detect anthropology there.
It is, yeah. So the title was a little bit contentious when I went with my first proposal for the press. They sort of rightly came back and said, this is a bit heavy-handed. When you put a title, aggression and suffering, it was definitely intended to really convey the subject matter that I'm dealing with here in terms of how this experience of expansion in the American South occurred. And I can't necessarily take full credit for it. The title is something that is borrowed from a phrase in a book by a Tennessean written in the early 19th century. John Haywood is going to write a history of Tennessee, basically the early formation of this state. And he is going to basically do this through somewhat of the methodologies of the modern-day historians use. He's going to have some documents and government records, but he's also going to interview people that he knows, basically some of the first settler families that arrive in Middle Tennessee, basically the area surrounding Nashville today. And he's going to encounter one such individual who describes the relationship between the early settlers and the Native Americans who are already in this region. And he is going to document that basically this family recollects this long continued course of aggression and suffering, that basically the settlers and the indigenous communities weren't able to basically stop fighting with one another, and that this was something that they were writing about in the early 19th century, reflecting back on at the end as events of the late 18th century. And that already by this time you have this conception by white settlers and their descendants of remembering the early encounters with indigenous peoples as one marked by violence and one marked by the legacy of this trauma of settler colonialism in the region. And it is certainly going to leave a lasting impact on indigenous people through erasure and dispossession, but it is also going to leave a legacy on how white Southerners and their descendants sort of experience this process and then remember it as well.
Well, you really start the story on the eve of the American Revolution in South Carolina. And I couldn't help but think of the number of Indian wars that had taken place in South Carolina since 1670, whether you're talking about the Yamasee War or the Tuscarora War. I mean, the Westo War, which was really the first one, which wiped out the Westo tribe. And South Carolina's role in colonial Indian affairs was really quite interesting. They always were making a deal with the Native Americans. The Catawbas, of course, are they an outlier in terms of your story? You want to explain that a minute?
Sure. Yeah. The Catawba are a little bit of an outlier in the context of my volume, in part because the Catawba are going to look in many instances to ally with the American colonists and then the United States militarily. For instance, at the start of the American Revolution, the Catawba are going to ally with the American colonists. They are going to provide scouts and warriors to basically assist in the South Carolina and Southern Colonies War against the Cherokee in 1776. So in that sense, the Catawba don't necessarily get a lot of attention in my book, in part because there is a focus more on sort of the violent interactions that occur throughout the Southeast in the late 18th century and then throughout the 19th century. So we see groups like the Cherokee, certainly, the Creek, and then the Seminole down in Florida play a pretty prominent role in how these interactions between settlers and indigenous people occur across the region.
So they're the exception in their willingness to become involved with the colonists in a way that's not violent. So is that to say, were there any other outliers that took that approach?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Catawba aren't necessarily going to be unique in choosing sides when these wars or civil wars occur. We see this sort of throughout colonial history, throughout 19th century history, of even groups under the same sort of cultural umbrella, sort of ethnically identifying as the same people, won't necessarily always align fully with one side or the other. We can take, for instance, the Creek War that occurs in 1813 and 1814, that there are going to be a faction of Creek Indians in western Georgia and eastern Alabama that basically promote sort of a what has sometimes been referred to as a traditionalist movement to try and expel American influences, but there will certainly be many Muskogee Creek Indians who are going to side with the United States, that will fight alongside the Americans against other Creek people. And we see similar occurrences during the Second Seminole War, when there are actually going to be Cherokee emissaries that will try and negotiate with Seminole Indians in Florida to try and advocate for an end to hostilities in the 1830s.
All right. I think that your opening introduction with the massacre of the Hampton family sets the stage. And so why don't you just relate that very quickly for our listeners?
Certainly, yeah. This was an instance that really embodied a lot of what my book was trying to get at. So the Hampton family is a famous South Carolina family. They are going to arrive in the South Carolina upstate in about the 1770s. They're going to come via North Carolina and going back to Virginia colonists as well. And Anthony Hampton is going to basically arrive around modern-day Greer, South Carolina. And he's going to set up a homestead in the Tiger River Valley. But when he does so, he's setting up this homestead in some contested space. Basically, as a result of the conclusion of the French and Indian War, there is a proclamation by the King of England, the Proclamation of 1763, that tries to establish this division between indigenous people and settlers, roughly using sort of the Appalachian Mountains as this guidepost. And so what's going to happen is there's going to be a brief period in which this area in between indigenous people and settlers are cleared out, the Tiger River Valley being in this buffer zone that's supposed to exist.
Well, most people forget that Pickens, Oconee, Anderson counties, that whole area, Greenville, that was Indian territory.
Yeah, that was Cherokee.
Which the local colonists had worked out with the Cherokees, a series of treaties, and the lines were pretty well set by the folks here. But the Hamptons were moving in from Virginia.
Well, yeah, the Hamptons are going to move from Virginia to North Carolina. Then Anthony Hampton is going to actually receive land grants for fighting in the French and Indian War. And he is going to look to utilize those land grants out west. But when he moves out west with his family, he's actually going to end up in South Carolina. So we have a lot of ambiguity about where he is settling, why he's doing it. And actually, historians, and myself included, haven't actually been able to find a deed for South Carolina's property that he settles on. And part because of this ill-defined border between the colonies, but not necessarily an ill-defined border between indigenous and settler space, that this is a very well-known what's referred to as the Indian boundary.
Well, I can tell you, lots of folks have been looking for that deed for Anthony Hampton's property for 200 years.
Yeah, and I don't know if anybody's going to find it. If you do, let me know. I'd be interested to see it. But yeah, so he's going to take advantage of this vacant, uninhabited space. But when he does so, this is an act of aggression. This is an encroachment on Cherokee borders. This is land that the Cherokee and the South Carolina colonists had agreed upon would be vacant to basically provide for the security of both peoples. So it's going to go, smoothly for a couple years. The Hampton family is going to be involved in the Indian trade, primarily focusing on deerskin and other commodities, going back and forth. But as tension rises between an increasing number of settlers moving in and along this Indian boundary, the Cherokee become worried. And as tensions begin to rise between the Americans, colonists, and the British Crown, there is this sort of escalating tension across the region. And so we see in the summer of 1776, the Cherokee are going to act. They're going to take preemptive action to basically push back these encroaching settlers along the Cherokee borders. And they're going to strike against these homesteads, not just the Hamptons, but others in North Carolina, across South Carolina, and even in Georgia as well. But what we see happening is the Cherokee War of 1776 becomes very sort of compartmentalized for the Hampton family, that there are going to be survivors of this attack along the Hampton homestead that basically relay what happened there and what they say they saw to subsequent generations. And so this is where we have this sort of the creation of these massacre narratives, that what is a part of this war for the Cherokee becomes a very isolated story that the Hamptons are going to tell basically their descendants and eventually the state of South Carolina widely about how basically a band of Cherokee warriors attacked their home, snuck up on them as friends, and then started a massacre, basically killing Anthony Hampton, his wife Elizabeth, one of their sons Preston. They're going to kill an unnamed grandson in pretty violent, and it will be described in pretty sort of horrific detail about how this infant is killed. And the Cherokee will also take John Bynum as a captive. So we'll see sort of the salacious details of...
We're talking bloody.
Yeah, the bloody, sort of gruesome, vile elements of war become memorialized, become compartmentalized. So the broader context, sort of in the memory of the Hampton family, will be sort of cast aside.
All right. You use that as an example, but the description, there were lots of frontier stories, and when the frontier stories are told, it's always bloody. The peaceful settlers were attacked by these vicious savages.
Mm-hmm. And I can hear your air quotes there, but yeah, peaceful and vicious, yeah.
Yes, and that becomes the narrative throughout the American South, or the Old Southwest, as it was called.
Yeah. So that's why sort of one of this opening vignette encapsulates a lot about what the book is trying to discuss, because time and time again, I'd see, settlers or settler histories of Tennessee, of Alabama, of Georgia, of Florida, of Mississippi have these sort of similar beginnings, that supposedly these, pioneers went out into the wilderness, they staked a claim, they planted in the ground, but then they were attacked by the Indians. And this isn't necessarily anything that's unique to the American South. It is sort of a story that gets retold across sort of the narratives of America's expansion. But what we see happening in the American South, sort of a specific time and sort of place and contextualization of how it becomes very regionally bound in sort of the nature of events, how it's remembered, and how it then gets sort of connected with other sort of momentous events in Southern history.
Well, you point out is, of course, South Carolina, in terms of European settlers, was very multicultural. Mm-hmm. But once there's violence on the frontier, people don't think of themselves as German or Scots-Irish or what have you. They begin to think of themselves as a community. Europeans are settler, South Carolina, whatever. They don't worry so much about the ancestors on the frontier.
Yeah, absolutely. So we see up through the 19th century, South Carolina militias not necessarily just being organized along county or city lines, but also being organized around ethnic or ancestral lines. So you'll get the German Fusiliers or sort of the Irish regiments or just sort of the city guard in larger populated areas. And these sort of ethnically sort of divided connotations become very muted at times of hostilities between, South Carolina and Indigenous peoples, even when those Indigenous peoples aren't necessarily threatening South Carolina borders. And one of the sort of quintessential examples of this in my work is South Carolina's relationship to the Second Seminole War. This is a war that occurs in 1835, that occurs in the Florida Peninsula while it's still a territory. And the Seminole are very actively trying to resist forced expulsion from their homelands as a consequence of the broader expulsion campaigns in the wake of the 1830 Indian Removal Act. So South Carolina is going to really lead the charge at organizing militias because they begin using languages about needing to save their Florida brethren, about needing to sort of save their kinfolk against these Indian depredations.
You make a number of interesting points about the Native Americans themselves. Mm-hmm. We talk about the Creeks. We talk about the Cherokee as if they were all one people, which they clearly were not. Mm-hmm. I mean, in South Carolina, we had the lower towns, mm-hmm. we had the upper towns, and you had the over the mountain. That was something the Europeans did. They considered them as a group when they really weren't.
Absolutely. Yeah, so this is sort of where it gets into this utilization of coalescence that I use as sort of a model for the book about sort of the binding of peoples. And this idea of coalescence is traditionally an anthropological sort of framework for understanding how Indigenous communities came together and how basically culturally similar but not necessarily always politically aligned or even geographically closely together, people sort of came to ascribe to a singular identity. And this is an ongoing process throughout the 17th, 18th, and even into the 19th century. We take, for instance, the Muskogee Creeks in Georgia and Alabama, that they are not necessarily immediately a single unified nation, just like the American colonies are not a single unified nation. But through these processes of colonialism, through this division between sort of ethnic others, there is this creation of a more consolidated or more unified identity that has different outcomes. Sort of coalescence is an emphasis on a process, not necessarily a product. So it is the binding of people with common goals, common culture, common identity that is going to operate among Indigenous communities, and it's going to also operate sort of on a regional scale for white Southerners.
Okay. Well, we mentioned the massacre of the Hamptons as a family. Probably the other big massacre story, of course, is Fort Mims.
Absolutely.
Just north of Mobile, where over 100 settlers were killed. Mm-hmm. And it became very much a part of the lore of the frontier. And having grown up in Mobile, we all knew about Fort Mims and the fact that really it was the negligence of the soldiers who let the sand pile up against the gate that they couldn't close the gate to the fort. So then all the Indians could just rush in and scalp everybody and set it afire, which they did.
Sure. Yeah. So Fort Mims is, again, going to be one of these sort of catalysts that generates a lot of sort of regional awareness about the need to work together and collaborate against this indigenous enemy, specifically the Red Stick Creeks. Fort Mims is going to be attacked by this faction of Red Sticks Creek that's trying to expel American influence and intervention within Creek society in western Georgia and eastern Alabama there. And it is going to have a cascading effect. The United States, particularly southern states, had been looking for a way to intervene in this developing civil war among the Creek towns that's occurring within Creek country. Fort Mims is certainly going to give justification for particularly Tennesseans, led by Andrew Jackson most vocally, to begin an invasion of Creek country. And we see during this invasion of Creek country by the southern states that it is going to be one that sort of demonstrates these divisions. There's going to be Creeks on both sides of this conflict, but we're going to see that the southern states are really going to take the lead in what becomes the 1813 Creek War, that the United States as a nation is very much preoccupied with the parallel war against against Britain in the War of 1812. So it's going to be basically on the Mississippi Territorial Militia, it's going to be on the Georgia State Militia, and then the Tennessee Militia to combat the Creeks through 1813 and 1814, with the Tennesseans really taking the lead. And this conflict is a brutal one. It's going to be one that is plagued by hunger, by deprivation, by violence against women and children, towns, and communities within Creek country. So we're going to see that this is going to be a hard war against Indigenous people, but it's also going to be one that is a hard war for the Americans, for the white Southerners that are fighting in it. There are going to be times in which Andrew Jackson feels that this is going to be a failure early on in the conflict. There's going to have to be retreats at different times, in large part because of lack of supplies, soldiers basically saying that their terms of enlistment are up and that they're ready to go home, that they don't want to be in northern Alabama trying to cut roads, suffering from starvation, disease, concern about basically Indian raids surprising them as they're on their march. But it is going to be one that will be ultimately successful by these southern states. And we see sort of in the subsequent years of this victory, it becomes more and more celebrated that those more sort of horrendous aspects of the conflict, both for the violence against the Indigenous people and the suffering that was endured by the militias early on in this conflict, kind of gets muted to one in which this war becomes something that is celebrated as Georgia, Mississippi, and Tennesseans working together.
It's a crusade.
In a sense, it could be. It is often seen, I think it could be seen as something of an effort of purifying the American South. It is going to be one of the largest land grabs in the pre-Civil War Southern history in terms of what the United States is taking from Indigenous people. It's going to be something like 22 million acres across what becomes sort of the heart of the Old South. And this 1813 Creek War is really a transformational moment in Southern history.
The brutality on the part of the militias was just as savage as the stories that were passed about what the settlers suffered. You point out that story has pretty much not become a part of the historical narrative. Mm-hmm. What the Native Americans suffered as opposed to the settler stories there, but even contemporaries at the time, some of them talked about how vicious the fighting was, particularly the massacre of Native American women and children.
Mm-hmm. I will like to point out that there's not necessarily a clear equivalency between sort of the two sufferings. For one, there is a clear differentiation that needs to be made that much of this violence is taking place on Indigenous land. So settlers are intruders in this space. And we see that Indigenous people are, in effect, defending their homelands, and that it is the settlers who are putting themselves in a position of peril, although not necessarily assuming that they are doing so. But yes, we see, particularly throughout the Creek War and then again in the Second Seminole War, that there is a decided effort to make sure that it is not just a military defeat, but it is one that is destroying and removing towns. We see at places like the Battle of Tuslahatchee, which is one of the first really significant victories for the Tennesseans in the Creek War, that almost all of the male warriors are going to be killed in this battle. And then the Tennesseans are then going to attack the town as well, where some warriors have tried to take refuge to basically defend their homes. So this is going to be a war against not just on a battlefield, but a war against a community. And there are some really horrific tales of some of the eyewitness accounts. People like Davy Crockett actually are involved in this assault. Future governor of Florida, Richard Keith Call, are involved in this assault. And they're going to describe some really gruesome scenes of homes being burned, of people being caught inside, of the smell of these bodies basically being charred in a flame as they're continuing to basically fire upon what is left of this community.
Gentlemen, I have to do one thing. It's a bit of housekeeping. Just tell you we're nearly at the 30-minute mark, so we need to sort of move along. But also, I have a question about this, and this is a very simplified 21st century perspective, but there's a part of my brain hearing these stories about the settlers moving into these territories, which were sometimes disputed, but often clearly Native American territories. There's a sense of entitlement going on here, is there not? We're entitled to, we have all these pressures on our populations, therefore this richer land, this more space, these more resources, we're entitled to go there because, well, we are.
Well, I mean, I think even in the 19th century, this is sort of the process of nation building, that the United States, that states like Georgia are looking to, take control of the land within what their borders are claimed to be. So you can see in some early examples in which settlers are going to move into western Georgia. They're going to do so without land titles. They're basically going to be squatting on this buffer area in between after the United States has secured independence. One of the interesting sort of series of documents I came across was these surveyor reports about basically looking to begin sort of marking off land, setting up to sell titles. And the surveyor comes across basically a fortification, some homesteaders sort of out on the Georgia frontier. And he writes back that says, well, this is kind of sandy pine area that's not necessarily worth a lot of money, but we have seen that these settlers operate as a bulwark against the depredations of the Indians from attacking further to the east. And he actually recommends that the land should just sort of be bequeathed to them because they have gone out there, sort of set up this homestead and endured the burden of Indian attack. So this sort of, maybe explains sort of a little bit of the mentality in terms of this idea of entitlement, in terms of, when it becomes the land legally recognized by the United States as, or the state of Georgia as marked off for sale to trade and purchase as a commodity, that it is something that is entitled to those who have sort of...
Well, also, if you lived in the Red Hills of South Carolina or Georgia, the Black Belt of Alabama and Mississippi certainly was far more enticing.
Oh, sure.
And there is a huge exodus of South Carolinians, and North Carolinians too, and into Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. Eventually they go on into Arkansas, but that's a later part of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. With the conclusion of the 1813 Creek War, basically western Georgia and southern Georgia and parts of Alabama are going to be pretty rapidly populated. And a lot of that migration is coming from South Carolina. And those South Carolinians are going to, again, not just move into the seized land, but they're going to move right up along the borders of these new sort of Creek territories and even Spanish Florida that again sort of creates sort of this circular pattern of settler encroachment, of indigenous resistance to that encroachment, and then the settlers petitioning either the state or the federal government to step in to basically provide for their security.
And of course then their infamous Trail of Tears, the forced removal of the Cherokee. But it wasn't just the Cherokee, was it?
Absolutely not. No, sort of we oftentimes associate sort of the Trail of Tears with the Cherokee, but sort of this forced expulsion of indigenous peoples across the Southeast as a consequence of the 1830 Indian Removal Act is going to be something that indigenous Southerners across the region are going to have to confront. We see the Cherokee certainly famously going through the legal route, trying to secure Supreme Court cases that ultimately do justify their right to remain, but there isn't the political will or the executive will to respect that Supreme Court decision. But we see the Seminole in Florida taking an alternative route of going to war against the U.S. military, against the Florida settlers to try and to defend their homelands to remain where they are, and that will ultimately be marginally successful. There will be several thousand Seminole that are expelled from the Florida Peninsula, but there will be a cohort that migrate further south after a long and arduous 7-year war that basically form the basis of the modern-day Seminole tribe of Florida.
You mentioned in your epilogue that there were individuals who had been part of that forced resettlement moving back to northern Alabama. Was that an unusual story or
So I didn't necessarily come across too many accounts of individual Native Southerners returning home. There's certainly examples. Taylane is a Yuchi woman who is going to be swept up in the creek removals of the 1830s. And she is going to be forcibly relocated to Oklahoma, but will be determined to return back to northern Alabama. And I think this sort of odyssey is going to be about a 5-year journey of being relocated by the U.S. military and then walking home to northern Alabama, where she will marry, have children, and sort of descendants in the region who identify as Yuchi today. And we can see that there are different ways in which this is certainly an unusual story, but the Seminole have a couple people who also sort of make the trek back to the Florida Peninsula as well. And these memories get passed down of sort of narrative of persistence, of resilience to colonialism.
Well, not everybody got removed because there was a large Creek settlement near Atmore, Alabama. I think it's become a reservation.
Yeah, so it's absolutely important to point out that there are going to be indigenous people across the Southeast, across Eastern North America, that will find different strategies to avoid forced relocation. We see the Cherokee, for instance, a band flee to Western North Carolina to form the basis of the modern-day Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. The Seminole, as I mentioned, is another group. And others will sort of hide their identity. What we see the Indian Removal Act being very effective of is basically eliminating indigenous nationhood in the American Southeast, that there is not going to be an ability to really have an indigenous government any longer like the Cherokee had or the Creek had prior to the Indian Removal Act. But that does not mean that indigenous people are going to be entirely exterminated from the Southeast. There will be different indigenous communities that find various strategies to basically remain in their homelands. The Catawba, for instance, are one of those really innovative examples in which they are going to be able to find ways to basically remain where they are in the South Carolina Piedmont for generations. They're going to look to legal negotiations, land leases with local settlers. They're certainly going to have sort of an idea of a Catawba nation dissolved in the 1830s, but they will then be able to reassert sort of their claims beginning in the 20th century.
Alfred is giving me the wind-up sign. So, Evan, any last comments before we sign off?
I'd just like to point out that I hope that this book opens the eyes to a lot of historians or readers who do not necessarily consider Native American history as part of Southern history. One of the objectives of this book and of the series that I'm involved in with the University of Alabama Press is Indians in Southern history. And it looks at ways in which we can integrate Native American history with Southern history, and that we can't necessarily really tell the story of the Southern past without accounting for the experiences and impact of indigenous people.
Evan Nooe, I want to thank you so much for being with us today on The Journal. I hope you enjoyed our conversation today. I know that I did. Aggression and Sufferings, Settler Violence, Native Resistance, and the Coalescence of the Old South is a thought-provoking book about the complicated history of the interactions between the many Native American tribes and European settlers in what is now the American South. And it was from the experiences and selective memory of settlers that a constructed sense of regional history and identity was created, which continued to flower into the antebellum period during westward expansion and well through the 20th century.
Walter Edgar's Journal is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. I'm Alfred Turner, and I produce the show, which is made possible by listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. Remember, the views and opinions expressed on Walter Edgar's Journal are not necessarily those of South Carolina Public Radio or its underwriters.
New episodes of Walter Edgar's Journal are published on the first and third Fridays of the month and are available at southcarolinapublicradio.org as well as from your favorite podcast provider. We'll talk again soon.